Thanks so much for being here this evening. We're going to be talking about UK rewilding. And disclaimer, I am not a rewilding expert by any means, but those of you who know me will know that I'm a massive rewilding nerd and do a lot of research and reading about rewilding in my spare time. And I've also just finished completing a big rewilding documentary in collaboration with filmmakers and other conservationists. So I'll be sharing a few clips from that this evening, just so that you can hear from other people and some experts in the field. And so what we're going to be looking at today is kind of an overview of large-scale rewilding in the UK. So looking at some of the species we used to have here, ones that were driven to extinction, and kind of ones that we could and should, maybe that's biased, but ones that we should have back if we are going to restore some kind of function to our ecosystems, because across the UK, they're really, really degraded. And then towards the end, we'll do a little bit about how rewilding can apply to communities and individuals at a local scale. Unfortunately, my colleague Alex, who was going to do a bit on that, is ill. So it'll be a little bit less than we would have done, but any information about that, we can always follow up. And feel free to ask questions throughout. You can just unmute yourself or put it in the chat, and we'll be monitoring that and then can answer them at the end. So I thought I'd just start off with what is rewilding, because I'm sure you've all heard the term, but it's kind of floated around in different circles and it means different things to different people. So this is the definition that Rewilding Britain give, which is a really good organisation working on rewilding across the UK. So they sum it up as the large-scale restoration of ecosystems to the point where nature can take care of itself. So I think that's key. You get nature to the point where it can just kind of tick over and do its own thing. And what I really like about this definition as well is that it says it gives nature and us a fighting chance. So saving wildlife, tackling climate breakdown, and kind of moving towards recovery and restoration instead of just protecting nature. So it's quite an active process. But thought it just worth mentioning that some people don't like the term rewilding. They think that it kind of implies that you're going back or trying to recreate conditions or landscapes kind of hundreds or thousands of years in the past, which don't exist anymore. So other terms you might hear are wilding or new nature. So it's that idea of kind of maybe moving forwards instead of looking backwards. Personally, I don't really think it's important arguing over the terminology that much. It's at its core, it's allowing ecosystems to take care of themselves and restore that function, kind of having that wilder future. Nature's healthy, so are we. But some people get into very heated debates about what the terminology is, but that's just me. So the UK has a really extensive history of wildlife exploitation, and quite shockingly, in the last 200 years in England alone, we've lost 400 species of plant and animal, so they've been driven to extinction. And so I really like this graphic here that someone's drawn, and this just shows you some of the species that we used to have here. So we used to have cave lions, we used to have bears, we used to have hyenas, we used to have grey whales in UK waters. Bison and elk kind of would be roaming around the landscapes. Beavers would have been widespread across all of the UK. Although they are making a comeback, I will come back to beavers later. You couldn't have a talk from me without me going on a tangent about beavers. But today, the UK is one of the most wildlife depleted countries in the world. And actually, the biggest carnivore that we have left is the badger. So nothing against the badger. Badgers are great. I love them. But without that balance of kind of top predators, so things like lynx, wolves, bears, as well as middle predators like badgers, foxes, and then prey, our ecosystems just aren't functioning properly. So one of the best examples of the importance of top predators in a landscape is actually the wolves in Yellowstone. So I'm sure that a lot of you have heard of the wolves and what happened there. So I'm going to play you a little animation from the documentary that we made, explaining what happened when the wolves went extinct and what happened when they brought them back, because it's quite shocking to see what happened. So can you hear that?
In America's Yellowstone National Park, the
Yeah.
wolf was hunted to extinction. And as a result of this, deer, which now had no predators, exploded in numbers and overgrazed the vegetation along the riversides. This led to the local extinction of the beaver, which also relied on critical riverside vegetation. But when the wolves were brought back in 1995, everything changed. The wolves reduced the deer numbers through predation, but they also changed the deer's behavior. The deer began to avoid places like the riverbanks, where they could be caught more easily, and in these places, the vegetation began to recover. The river valleys, previously stripped bare by the deer, began to reforest, and so the numbers of forest birds began to grow as well. And when the riverside vegetation came back, so too did the beavers. The beavers then did all the engineering we've seen on the River Otter in Britain, and so aquatic diversity skyrocketed. The wolves even affected the soil. The riverside trees stabilized the stream banks, reducing erosion, and on the hillsides, the trees sheltered the soils from being whipped away by the harsh winter winds. And by controlling numbers of smaller predators like coyotes, the wolves allowed populations of small mammals and birds to increase. And scavengers like eagles and bears profited from the kills that the wolves didn't finish. And because there were more trees, more bears got through the winter as they could feed on the abundant berries that the trees produced. This is the essence of a trophic cascade. The reintroduction of a single keystone predator transforms the ecology of every aspect of the ecosystem.
So that is an example in Yellowstone, but could be applied anywhere. It just shows you what happens when one key species like the wolf is taken out and the huge catastrophic effects that that can have throughout the ecosystem. So in the UK, kind of how that relates is we have about 2 million deer at the moment, which is a lot of deer, and it's the highest that they've ever been for 1,000 years, the numbers of deer that we have at the moment. And so, with no natural predators to control them, they're decimating landscapes, and we're having to use culling as a means to control them because there aren't any natural predators. Whereas if we did bring things back like lynx and wolves, this could restore some of that predator-prey balance, and it could help keep their numbers in check as well. So that's hopefully shows you why it's important that we have those top predators. So kind of going back to the UK a little bit. So the UK is actually in the bottom 10% globally of countries for biodiversity. And 1 in 6 species in the UK are threatened with extinction. But if you go out and talk to people in the UK, you get a very different opinion and perspective. I don't know if you guys have found that people, when they describe the UK, they might say it's lush, it's green, it's wild. And we've come to believe that this mosaic of farmland, like you can see in that picture, that quintessential British landscape, we think that's natural and we think that's wild, when actually from a biodiversity perspective, it's quite poor. But there's a really interesting reason why we think that's natural, and that's because of something called shifting baseline syndrome. So has anyone, just show of hands, has anyone heard that term before? Yeah, Emma, you have. Yeah, Luke as well. Do you want to have a shot at trying to explain what that is? I've got an animation to explain it, but just go ahead.
I think isn't it when you're used to seeing something for so long, you assume that's how it should be. Like in my generation, I'm used to seeing what you've just shown, whereas my parents or maybe grandparents would be used to maybe seeing something a bit different. But because, do you know what I mean? It's been around for so long, you now class that as normal.
Yeah, perfect. That's exactly what it is. And I'm going to get this lovely man called Paul Jepson to explain it. So he is, but it's exactly what you said, Emma. But so Paul is one of the men who we interviewed for the documentary, and he's a zoologist, conservationist. He has a lot of experience with rewilding and shifting baseline. Let me try and get it to the right place. And he just gives some really nice examples of what shifting baseline means and looks like. And this is all due to a fascinating social phenomenon called shifting baseline syndrome. We met with Paul Jepson, a rewilding ecologist, to talk more about how efforts to rewild Britain are being influenced by shifting baseline syndrome.
So we've been exploring this really transformative journey through rewilding. And now that we've gotten to the carnivores, we're noticing that perceptions really start to harden up. And this is where it seems to have gotten, but no further. Can you tell us a bit about why that might be?
I think some of it may relate to what we call the shifting baseline syndrome, which is quite a big idea in rewilding. It comes from fisheries, but it's this idea that every generation assumes that the natures we experience in our youth or when we're studying or whatever are the natural. And over time, we lose track of what the natural baselines were. Of course, when it comes to predators, in Britain, our ancestors wiped out the big predators, centuries or millennia ago. So there's been generation after generation for whom the nature of Britain hasn't included predators. And not only does predators not quite seem part of the natural order of things in the UK, I don't think we know how to live with predators. We've lost the sense of just how abundant birds used to be, even back in the 1970s or 80s, because we're not, we come into a place like this and we see the odd bird and we think, oh yeah, that's how it is. That's the sort of natural bird abundance in it. And it's hard to imagine a place with more birds knocking around in it. So this is really the idea of the shifting baseline syndrome, that it's just this gradual accretion of our concepts on what nature could be, such that at the moment in the UK, our notions of the natural are at such a low ebb that it's almost hard to imagine what they could become.
So to give us a bit more of an idea of the scale of what we're talking about here, could you give us some examples of shifting baseline syndrome?
So in some ways, here's quite a nice place to think about those notions of shifting baseline. So if my daughters come down here at the moment, this for them is natural. It's got beautiful trees around it. There's a river. If I'd come down here in the 1970s with my girlfriend, I'd have been seeing something quite different. There wouldn't have been these trees around. It'd have been a much more open landscape. There would have been cows in these fields. It'd have been full of meadowsweet. There'd have been swallows buzzing around on it. There would have been butterflies. There would have been a hum of it. And for me, that would have been natural. Okay. So my daughters have a totally different sense of baseline to what I did. Equally, if we go back, to before or around the foundings of Oxford, 1200, 1300, this would have been a meandering river with sandbanks in it and water lily pads and fish coming up it. It'd been quite a different thing. Let's go back 1,000 years. This would have been all braided in it with deep beaver dams on it. It'd have had willow scrub bushes and aspen coming on it, and it had been just full of frogs and birds and whatever. And probably if we went back even further, you'd have had a herd of aurochs coming down here. But actually, where it is now, it sort of looks all right, but there's very little microhabitat diversity in it. It's just tree, little glade, hard edge, straight down, channel, back up, flat, back up. It's really in poor shape.
So I found that really, really powerful, hearing him describe what that looked like going back and hearing that it would have been braided with beavers, and then you could have had aurochs, and it just set my mind racing of what that could have looked like in the past. And so shifting baseline syndrome is really good at explaining why we've come to accept kind of these low levels of biodiversity as natural and normal. But it doesn't stop us from doing something about it. So we can still reverse some of that extinction and restore function to degraded ecosystems. And one of the best ways that we can do this is by reintroducing native species. So particularly keystone species. So they are kind of like the glue that holds ecosystems together. So without them, other species start to decline, biodiversity starts to degrade. So it all kind of falls apart when these species are removed, the wolves being an example in Yellowstone. And all of the species you can see on the screen here are considered keystone species. And actually, if we were to bring these back, that could start to change that shifting baseline syndrome and get more of that wild that Paul was describing in the past. So actually, I'll talk about this more in a minute, but we do have bison, beavers, boar, and wildcats back in the UK to some capacity. Lynx and wolves, it's proposed, but there's some attitude perceptions that mean that that might take a couple of decades for that to become a reality. So this is not an extensive map by any means. This is just some key rewilding projects that I've picked out that I wanted to draw attention to. So these are some of the rewilding initiatives and projects that have happened or are happening to bring back some of those key species. And I could go through, I'll pick out some of these. So number 2 and number 5 at the top in Scotland are Scottish wildcats. So one of those is a captive breeding site for the wildcats, which they then hope to reintroduce into the wild. And number 5 is actually the Cairngorms National Park, where they have put in a small population of Scottish wildcats. So there are a few now in the wild. It's the first baby predator that we are looking at putting back. So hopefully that will continue. You can see the white-tailed seagull. So that's at 1, 7, and 19. So they brought them back to the Isle of Rum, into Ireland, and also the Isle of Wight. So that is an example of a top predator that has been brought back, and they are expanding. They're doing quite well, even though there is some persecution still. I had to put lots of beavers on there because I want you to know where all the beaver sites are and where you can go see them. Number 17 down here is the river otter. So this is the wild population of beavers that went through a trial period, and then they were given legal status and said they're allowed to stay, they're allowed to be wild. So that's probably the best place to see them and to see the impacts that they have on the ecosystem. You've got number 12 here, which is wild boar in the Forest of Dean, which never would have happened legally, but the wild boar were in some farms, they escaped, they did really well, and the government couldn't really do anything about it. So they are now staying and are doing really well. So that's kind of a slightly illegal reintroduction, but really good for the ecosystem. And then one which I'm going to go into a bit more detail down here, 22, is wild ableen. So that is the bison that have been brought back. And last one I'll mention on here is 21 with the stork, and that is Knepp. Have any of you been to Knepp before? It's such an amazing, from what I've heard, example of what's possible in the UK. They have beavers, they have storks, they have Tamworth pigs, all sorts, and it used to be intensive agriculture. So it kind of shows what's possible and transformative in the space of only a couple of decades. But I can share this map with you and you can explore it more in your own time. I thought I'd then touch a little bit more on beavers. And beavers is quite an interesting one to talk about, because with any species, when you're reintroducing them when they've been extinct, particularly for long periods of time, it's really important to remove the threats which drove them to extinction in the first place. Because otherwise what's going to happen is the animals are going to keep being persecuted, keep being exploited, and the cycle is just going to repeat itself, and then reintroductions become somewhat pointless. So the reason that beavers went extinct in the UK is because they were exploited for almost all their body parts. And when I say all body parts, I mean all body parts. So their fur was used for hats and coats, their teeth and their claws were used to make jewelry, their meat was eaten, and perhaps most bizarrely, a liquid from their anal scent glands called castoreum was used as a flavor enhancer, as a perfume, and as a vanilla flavor additive as well. So lovely humans, that is why we drove beavers to extinction. And something that I found quite shocking is actually that all of these products that you can see, including the weird beaver anal scent gland secretions, you can buy those. They're still available to buy. All of these are things that you can still purchase today. So the threats to beavers definitely haven't been eliminated, but through conservation efforts, public awareness, education programs, and the fact that they're now also protected by law means that the threats have been greatly reduced, and we're sort of slowly learning to live alongside beavers again. So that will apply to a lot of other species too, like the raptors, the birds of prey. There are compromises that have to be made and for the threats to be reduced to be able to live alongside them. So why is it good that we have species like beavers back in our landscapes? So beavers come under that category of keystone species, so that glue that holds ecosystems together. And they can transform and shape landscapes kind of in a way that no other species can. And this has huge knock-on effects for other species. So I love this illustration that shows how other species can thrive and benefit from beavers. So this is a beaver-created habitat or a beaver-created wetland or pond. So what happens is when beavers cut down trees for food or building their dams, they then make, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this here is the beaver dam. And then behind that, the water level raises and it creates these things called beaver ponds. So this is deep water, which will be really good for fish species like salmon and trout. It's great for amphibians, dragonflies, water birds, things like these stumps that are left in the water. They're used by woodpeckers, bats, even as perching sites for birds of prey. And then the dead wood that's left in the water and on land is really good for fungi, invertebrates, amphibians, again, all sorts of things that shelter from predators. So just the scale of what one species can achieve for biodiversity, I think is shown so well with the beaver. And it's not just wildlife that benefits from something like the beaver. We do too, massively. And they're fantastic allies as well to help tackle things like the biodiversity crisis and climate change. So I'm sure most of you are aware of these things that beavers are able to do. So they can mitigate flooding, so reduce the risk of homes flooding. They can prevent flash floods. Again, really important in the face of climate change when we are going to have more severe floods, more severe storms. And also they can help prevent drought as well, because like you saw in that beaver pond and this wetland here on the picture, they actually hold water. So other areas might become dry, but the beaver wetlands will keep that water there and prevent drought. And perhaps one of the most amazing things I hadn't quite realised. So in this picture, the middle bit is the beaver created wetland, and then everything around it has been burned by wildfires. So it's all charred, completely black, yet the beaver created wetland is almost untouched. And that's because they've managed to create this sort of micro environment that's behaving differently to the rest of the environment. And again, in the face of global warming and climate change, imagine if we were to have more of these beaver wetlands around. That could hugely reduce the risk of wildfires and things being completely burnt down, whereas this is nicely preserved in the middle. They also do things like improve water quality and store carbon. So all in all, they are very, very impressive, and I will not stop singing their praises. Another species that I wanted to focus on is bison. So I don't know if many people know that we have bison back in the UK. I feel like in this room, possibly. Oh, some shaking heads, some nodding. But the general public definitely, I think, is not hugely aware that we have bison back. So bison in themselves are, the fact that they're here at all is an amazing success story. So after the First World War, the European bison numbers fell so dramatically that they were basically extinct, and someone decided that they wanted to try and stop them from going extinct, and they had a founding population of 12 bison. So that's all that was left. They had 12 that came from private zoos and collections that they then put into a breeding program. And so today there are around 9,000 bison in the European breeding program, but from a founding population of 12, which just shows you how close they were to going extinct. So in the UK, actually I can go back and show you where they are on the map. So they are down here, number 22, in a place called Wildebleen. So this is near Canterbury, and it's a collaboration project between Kent Wildlife Trust and Wildwood Trust. And pretty recently, so it was in 2022, they brought back a little herd of bison to the Westbleen woodlands, which are located down there. And so they started off with 3 females and 1 bull, who quite amusingly was delayed due to Brexit paperwork. So he was supposed to arrive at the same time as the females, but then Brexit paperwork got in the way and he had to come a bit later. And one of the females they didn't know was pregnant and gave birth to a little calf shortly after. And then this December, one of the matriarch has just had another little calf. So there are now 6 bison in Bleen, and they are there to, as sort of a nature-based solution, really. They're there to manage the woodland and to shape the habitat and show what's possible without machinery and human intervention. So there are fences, they're not just bison wandering around the streets of Canterbury, they are enclosed, and they have these awesome bison tunnels that you can walk over, and if you're lucky enough, the bison will come underneath. So definitely a project that I would recommend visiting. And I'm just going to show you a little animation similar to the wolves of what what bison do in the landscape.
Thing of how this woodland changes and has changed for hundreds of years and will continue to change. And so it's just about how we meet the needs of people and the needs of wildlife and redress that balance, I think.
Megaherbivores like bison play a disproportionately large role in the functioning of healthy ecosystems. Their grazing breaks up woodland, their browsing controls the growth of young trees. By defecating, they fertilize the soil. By smashing through vegetation, they create pathways through forests and create microhabitats, and their wallowing creates wetlands. And in death, they provide a bonanza of food and nutrients for scavengers and predators. On an ecological level, this causes disturbance of plants and supports parasites, scavengers, and predators, as well as all the smaller creatures that live in the microhabitats that bison create. This aids seed dispersal and the spread of nutrients throughout the landscape.
So that's the wonderful world of bison. I haven't actually seen the bison in person. So when I went, it was in the preparation stage where they were still building the enclosures and the fences and the bison tunnels. But what I quite like about it is that you might go and you might not see them. So they're not there for people. They're not there like a zoo. They're there to manage the woodland. And if you happen to see them, it'll be this thrilling wildlife experience where, yeah, you get to be in the presence of these amazing mega herbivores. So I could go on about a lot of the other projects as well. I'm happy to go about, like, explain those in more detail at the end. But I just wanted to focus on those 2 as examples. And then these are just some examples of how rewilding can be applied at a community or an individual level. So these are things that most of you are already doing currently. Things like hedgehog highways, urban ponds, wildlife-friendly gardening, removing invasive species, planting trees, wildflower meadows, particularly if they're native species and can support wildlife year round. Stopping using pesticides and fertilizers, having those wood piles for invertebrates, different insects, wildlife corridors, bird feeders, nest boxes. Restoring soil and grass is a big one. I know not everyone has the capability to introduce pigs into their gardens or park spaces, but they're really good for kind of resetting the soil and grass health so that you're at a baseline where the soil is nice and turned over. And a lot of those rewilding projects on that map are using Tamworth pigs, which are those lovely kind of orange coloured pigs that have a similar function to wild boar, which is all about rooting and getting that nice, all those good things in the soil upturned and bringing that to the surface. Also got things like hedgerows, and kind of linking back to the beavers as well is engaging the public. So kind of explaining why you're doing what you're doing is also quite important. So I know several of you have signs saying what's happening or what's growing. But often people don't know or don't understand. So if something's left long or if there's wildflowers growing, I've often seen signs being like, bees live here, or if you can create a hedgehog highway, having a little sign saying, we're doing this so that hedgehogs can move from this part of the neighborhood to the other, so that people can get a bit more behind the initiatives that you're putting in place. Otherwise, kind of like with the beaver and with the birds of prey, it could fail because there isn't that public engagement and perception of what's happening. And then here are just some resources, so some books about rewilding. I'm sure there's a much more extensive list. Ones on here that I really like are Bringing Back the Beaver by Derek Gow. That's a real insight into his journey into reintroducing and rewilding beavers. I also like this one, Rewilding. I think it's The Radical New Nature. I can't remember the rest of the title, but that's by Paul Jepson, the man who you heard speaking about shifting baseline syndrome. And there's an audiobook version of this on Spotify. And also the actual hardcover book has all these wonderful animations and diagrams explaining all these key rewilding principles. So that's one that I really like. And one that isn't on here, but I don't know if you can see this because my background is blurred, is Missing Links by Ross Barnett. So it goes through chapter by chapter of all the different mammals that we would have had in the UK. So it's like a real dive into Pleistocene Britain, where we would have had cave lions and maybe hippos in the Thames and things like that. So it lets you, it's a good dreaming book, that one, but really, really well written. And then here are some other resources. So some online websites where you can find out more. Rewilding Europe and Rewilding Britain are fantastic. So within those websites, they have loads of toolkits and book recommendations, podcasts, and then there's a few more resources there on small scale rewilding, because I'm aware that I massively talked about large scale rewilding a lot more, but there are a lot of resources of how that can be applied at a smaller scale.